Okay. Give everybody just a minute more to get started. Actually, that piece was something I had written 6 months or so ago, prior to the pandemic and everything. And ironically, the name of the piece is Out of the Woods. And I don't think we're out of the woods yet regarding COVID-19 anyway. So a bit of an ironic title and a very sort of positive outlook on the future. Like I said, it was written in November for 9 cellos. It made me think of a story that I had regarding my graduate instructor in Northern Illinois University, my cello teacher, Mark Johnson, who passed away a number of years ago, great cellist. And I told him about my interest in cello ensembles and things. And he looked at me and said, I've never liked cello ensembles. And I said, really? But I mean, you're this great, famous cellist and you don't like cello ensembles? And he said, well, it's just too much cello. And I mean, he was a career quartet cellist. He played with the Vermeer string quartet for many decades. And he really thought cello ensemble was too much cello. And I still don't agree, but I understood later much more so what he meant when I was at Istanbul Bilgi University on the faculty there, teaching in Istanbul. And I had a very famous saxophone player as an office mate, a guy named Ricky Ford. And Ricky had a saxophone ensemble, like 7 saxophones playing together. And they were really fantastic. All his students were great students. And with a teacher like Ricky, it was a fantastic group. But I heard them play a couple times. I went out and yeah, that was too much saxophone for me. And I understood what my old mentor meant when he said that it's too much cello in cello ensemble. Although I still write for cello ensemble. I like it a great deal. My name's Jeff McCauley, and welcome to my Composition Online 6-minute, very brief 6-minute webinar regarding 20th century compositional techniques. I did this last week and called that part 1 because it just seemed to be too much to talk about in 6 minutes, and probably still is. So I'm continuing this week. Last week we looked at first the music of Claude Debussy and Impressionism, and then composers of the Second Viennese School, Schoenberg and atonality, and his students, Anton Webern and Alban Berg. And I say that really Schoenberg's 12-tone technique was the seeds for serialism, and more so especially with the music of his students, and particularly Anton Webern, I say, because really serialism in music, and I say composers such as Milton Babbitt took the music of the Second Viennese School one step further by organizing not only the pitches in a strict mathematical order, but all aspects of the music. So we saw that how Schoenberg was using a matrix of composition to really have a mathematically organized way a mathematically way of organizing the pitches in a very strict manner, as to not stress any individual tone more than others, that would imply tonality. That with serialism, composers started to really look at all aspects of the music and not just the tones, and organizing them in a very similar mathematical way, meaning the meter, rhythm, sometimes even orchestration, just every aspect you can think of was taken in this very sort of strict mathematical context. And Milton Babbitt himself was a mathematician. And we'll see that serialism, while it really gained some momentum from 1950 on, it started to die out, and really it was minimalism that started to fight against atonal music and serialism. And I believe that humans really gravitate towards tonality. That while serialist music and atonal music, very interesting, sometimes music to really to study and analyze and really say, wow, that's fascinating, versus sitting back and being able to enjoy this art for what it was, that it was an audio art and something music to enjoy. I really think that human beings tend to gravitate towards tonal music, and therefore minimalism, I feel, won out and is still being much stronger today. I mean, minimalism was a movement to fight against atonality in music and in this complex way of looking at music, because minimalism was highly tonal music, predominantly consonant and rhythmically stable, almost hypnotic in nature. And it wasn't just the rhythm that was hypnotic in nature, sometimes even just the minimal chord progressions used, that it was predominantly consonant. But there was subtle changes that really drive tension in the music. And I say, well, we're in classes, we're going to talk about the music of Philip Glass, Steve Reich, and Terry Riley, using subtle changes and development to drive tension in their music. One piece that really opened my ideas as a composer, and really sort of shook me to my core, was a piece called Violin Phase by Steve Reich. Now, I believe he wrote 3 of them. There's piano phase and either oboe phase or clarinet phase. I think it's oboe phase. But Violin Phase was my favorite, and I think the most famous one, where he was taking a very small motive that he wrote for solo violin. And I don't say a subject or a theme, because really it was a very small motive, just a bar or 2. And basically having recordings of this motive, but having 2 recordings played side by side, let's say. And then the story is put his thumb on one of the tapes to slow it down just a tad, so much so that you almost couldn't tell until over time, and you would see this music start to move away from itself because they were moving at different speeds, and how it would evolve over time, that you wouldn't even, I say subtle changes, because you wouldn't even realize that the music was changing until all of a sudden it was vastly different, it seemed, than when it started. And this was the idea with minimalism, taking very small ideas, simple ideas, and not very many of them, and really squeezing what you can out of them. And I think minimalist music influenced rock and other popular forms of music, and is still sort of thriving today. So we'll speak about these 2 forms of music as music after 1950 is what I was saying. However, it's not just music after 1950 I'm speaking about, because I'll bring up composers right now that definitely were working prior to 1950. We're also going to speak about neoclassicism and quotation music. Now, composers who worked with neoclassicism wanted to return to the ideology found in classicism: order, balance, clarity, economy, and emotional restraint. So these composers really, while they were using a modern vocabulary, let's say, with harmony and dissonance, and sometimes polytonal techniques and this sort of thing, that still they were much more concerned with keeping traditional form. We'll start seeing composers using sonata allegro form again, and thinking about a real exposition and a development and a recapitulation and this sort of thing, but within a modern tonal vocabulary, let's say. The 2 composers we'll speak about in class are Igor Stravinsky and Paul Hindemith. Stravinsky's especially interesting to me because he had such a long and varied career that, he starts out with the ballets, and then later then moves into neoclassicism. And then even later than that starts working with atonal music. And I mean, really was one of the most versatile composers of the 20th century. Now, quotation music is exactly what it sounds like it is, when a composer directly quotes music from a past musical composition. So the 2 composers we're going to be looking at in class would be Charles Ives and Ellen Taft Swillich. I should just mention Charles Ives is an incredibly interesting composer of the 20th century as well, in a sense that he was, I believe, way ahead of his time. One piece that we'll look at regarding quotation music would be 3 Pieces in New England, which was written between 1910 and 1919, I believe, but then had even versions as late as 1929, and I believe even sketches as early as 1903. He was a very interesting composer. He was quoting, things like Yankee Doodle in that piece. And he did so partially, the story I heard about his training growing up, that his father would help his musical training by having him sing with his siblings. And they would really do these exercises to move away from traditional tonal harmony. And that, for example, they might sing "Row, row, row your boat." And Charles would start out, "Row, row, row your boat." And then his brother would do a half step higher, "Row, row, row your boat." But they would sing them together. So they would have to sing in harmony of minor seconds, or maybe a major seventh, let's say, or tritones. So he was developing his ear at a very young age within his family. But through his life, he actually sold insurance to make a living. So he was really one of these artists that, stuck at it. I mean, his compositions piled up outside of his Connecticut home in a garage, and he was selling insurance most of his life. But he really goes down as one of the great composers of the 20th century, and in my mind, way ahead of his time. We're also going to speak about aleatory music, or chance music. I almost was going to leave this out, but it's really so important. Two composers I'll mention right now: John Cage, and everybody's probably heard of 4 minutes and 33 seconds, which is a wonderful piece in so many different ways. I mean, one where here's a composer that's using silence in music, and silence is definitely an aspect of music. The moment when the music stops, creating so many different feelings, so many different tensions, whether it be anticipation of what's next, or the silence needed to digest all that was heard. There's many uses of silence. And John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds is a piece where the pianist goes out with a stopwatch, sits at the piano, and sits there and doesn't do anything for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. Now, once this piece had premiered, everybody knows what it is. So the surprise is a bit gone from the piece. But the premiere must have been just incredible, because not knowing what to expect, and here's a great modern composer with a new piece, and a pianist goes out there and does nothing. And really what the piece is the little sounds within the audience of uncomfortable awkwardness, let's say, of nothing happening and wondering what's going to be. And so this piece would be different every time it's performed. And that's the idea with chance music, is that there are aspects of randomness that are put into the music to have each performance very different. Now, you could say that every performance is different than any other performance. I could play a piece of Bach, but nobody's ever going to play that piece of Bach just like I did. But chance music takes this one step further, where the composer really instructs the performer to do things that would drastically change the piece each time. For example, there's a composer, a Canadian